Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host today, your temporary host, I think you'll be pleased to know, Terence Corrigan. Nicholas being temporarily unavailable, and we all hope he's having a great time. And we send our fond greetings. I'm joined today by a venerable pair, Sara Gon, well known to many of you. How are you today, Sara?
I'm better than I look. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, Sara had an unfortunate meeting with some paving stones. And Michael Morris, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. And Sara, you certainly don't look worse for wear to me. So, but good to see you both.
Oh, that's very kind.
Well, worse for wear is unfortunately something that we can say about our country day by day. Let's dive right into it. Got a couple of good items today. The first of which is judgment that was handed down in a court in Pietermaritzburg on our former president Jacob Zuma, trying to sue a journalist, Karen Morn. Personally, I think one of our best media personalities. For supposedly invading his privacy and impairing his dignity. Michael, you spent your career in the media. What do you make of the story?
I mean, I think a very good judgment. Just as an aside, actually, it's kind of personally delightful too, because I remember Karen Morn as an intern actually in the Argus newsroom in I think probably the 90s. When she was still a student at Rhodes University studying journalism there. And it was always, wonderful every December for about 3 years. I think that she would return home on back and spend some time with us. So she, as you say, she's emerged as a very significant figure, I think, on the journalism scene. A very interesting case. Just if kind of few points. It's I think important that as News 24 reports here, that the court accepted the arguments put forward by SANEF, the South African National Editors Forum, Media Monitoring Africa, and the Campaign for Free Expression. So a very sizable body of opinion there, working on the same premise, that Zuma's harassment of Morn equates to a so-called SLAP, S-L-A-P-P, strategic lawsuit against public participation suit, and that the court needs to protect journalists in cases like this. And it really does come down to the public interest importance of free speech being practiced daily by the country's journalists. It doesn't guarantee that there aren't mistakes. It doesn't guarantee that there aren't possibly errors of judgment at times and things that we would prefer maybe not to have occurred or be reported or be intruded upon. But as a general rule, it is essential to the dynamism of the national conversation, but also the authenticity of it. The people are talking about the country as it is, the real stuff, the difficult stuff to look at, and we count on journalism, and free speech to enable this. To know that every time we wake up in the morning and we consider the fate of ourselves, our fate of our country and our society, that we are actually looking at the freest reflection of it. And so I think this is a very important judgment in that context.
No, I think Peter du Toit over at News 24 called it a magnificent moment, and I think that's quite accurate. As one of our viewers said, nothing more than delaying and stalling his own prosecution. I think that pretty much sums it up. For a man who just wants his day in court, he seems to be remarkably resistant to actually taking that, but is quite prepared to draw others into court. You mentioned free expression. I think that's where I'd like to bring Sara in, particularly for the from the background of the Free Speech Union, because we've seen a couple of stories which have a certain resonance here. There's the case of Mr. Nene in Pretoria who's been dragged to court on the basis of the Cyber Crimes Act, because he photoshopped a couple of porn images with Becky Cele and Cyril Ramaphosa's face, which Audrey and Basson, with whom we have our occasional differences, said that this was absolutely chilling. It seems to me, as crude and as offensive as that might be, the public figures, and they, lampooning them. This isn't taking your private sex tape and leaking it onto the internet. This is essentially saying that you're useless. I mean, so, Sara, what's your take on all this?
I think what the two things. Well, excuse me. Almost the cliche is to say we have much bigger legal problems and criminal problems to deal with than some guy, doing a bit of photoshopping. And also, the very fact that they're going after him smacks of the sort of legislation that you see in African countries, where any insult to the president or high up worthy can be the subject matter of criminal action. And it is such an egregious common problem in African jurisdictions. I mean, the one thing we've said about our free speech is that, weird as our country is, we have an astonishing amount of it, and we have an association with the Free Speech Union UK, and they have some extraordinary cases that we don't even have, don't come close to having to worry about. But these two cases are both illustrative. One of the sort of the police force having nothing better to do but then deal with essentially an insult to politicians, and the other one is I think as the viewer said, it's delaying tactics, but I think he made the real mistake of going against two real professionals, to go against Billy Downer as the prosecutor and Karen Moore, who's a legal journalist.
Right.
The first is a disgrace. The second is a disgrace, but it's been exonerated by or rather overcome by the judgment itself. It's actually quite a long judgment, so I haven't gone through it. But essentially, Zuma's been interdicted from launching a summons in a private prosecution, and he has to pay the cost.
Interesting also for a guy who pleads poverty, when it's convenient. He does seem to have rather deep pockets.
He's friends with rather deep pockets.
Well,
I see. One of our commenters, one of our audiences made that very point. And as Sara says, we've got so many other things really should be worrying about and to worry about, and spend money on solving. And here we are being pulled into actions like this that are squandering resources and so on, and time, attention. But yeah.
And Sara, I believe that the Free Speech Union actually called out Zimbabwe for doing something very very similar in its legislation.
Yeah, well, they have a raft of nasty laws, but they've just enacted an amendment to one of their laws. Sorry, I can't remember the full name of it, but it's basically called the Patriotic Bill. Now that's should already have one's hairs standing up. And basically it puts a prohibition on anyone talking to in other foreign services. In other words, talking to diplomats, talking to such people. And the idea being that it must not be done in with the purpose of undermining the country. The problem is that the words that are used are not defined. So it's very much up to the courts to decide what they mean, and depending on how pliant your courts are, will depend on whether the government gets the decision it wants. But I mean, we cited a number of examples of particularly journalists and opposition leaders who've been imprisoned recently on really nonsense charges. And so Zimbabwe is the perfect example of the state that will put in place rafts of legislation that will inhibit people's speech. And look where Zimbabwe is now. I mean, look where we are. But
well, I understand that some of that framework was inherited from the erstwhile Rhodesia, and it was then refined and updated, as many other things fell apart. But yes, and as you say, it depends on the strength of your judiciary. But I think former President Mugabe made it very clear what he thought of the judiciary. So yeah, this is the dangerous time to be some sort of civil libertarian big mouth in Zimbabwe these days, or
Indeed,
thoughtful commentator in Zimbabwe these days.
Exactly. You're talking about the things dating back to the unlimited past. One's reminded of our own oppressive period, post-war period, in the phrase in this Zimbabwean law that it is impermissible to harm the country's positive image and integrity or reputation, and that's very. It implies an existing probity which simply doesn't exist.
Well,
positive image.
As one of the commentators says, the most patriotic thing may be to organize, some sort of disobedience with or without a foreign power. But that, in fact, is acting against the government may be the most patriotic thing you can do.
But I think the thing that we can take away from Zimbabwe most clearly, I think it was a slogan at one stage: ZANU PF is Zimbabwe and Zimbabwe is ZANU PF. If that's the way you sort of structure your national polity, then yes, talking about maybe winning an election or whatever becomes an act of sedition.
Yeah.
No, sad days indeed, but good signs emerging out of Pietermaritzburg. Moving along, something else that I understand comes from KwaZulu-Natal is our Water and Sanitation Minister, Senzo Mchunu, and he has just published draft regulations in terms of the National Water Act, which have caused, I think, a well-merited degree of concern. Amongst other things, these would limit access to sizable to licenses for sizable amounts of water to enterprises meeting mandatory thresholds of black ownership. In fact, the actual text says in a phrase really reminiscent of the 1970s: percentage allocated to blacks. I didn't, that's not my terminology. So we're not even trying to be politically correct about it. But yes, if you as an enterprise need a license for over 1 million cubic meters of water, this will only be granted if your enterprise is 75% black owned. This is essentially for a family-owned agricultural enterprise, which and family ownership is the kind of dominant mode there. That essentially disqualifies and white-owned enterprises from participating at scale. There was an interesting piece in the Financial Mail, which I would just like to read to our listeners. Not that we need any more signs that the governing ANC has zero compunction in betting the country's future on its short-term populist interests, but Water and Sanitation Minister Senzo Mchunu's proposed new water licensing rules are a stark reminder of what's at stake. Yeah, I think that for a country that's battling 14% year-on-year food price inflation, this just threatens to, I actually struggle to verbalize it. What does it mean? The sort of end of commercial agriculture, perhaps.
My favorite line in this editorial, great Financial Mail editorial, is this characterization of what we're seeing. It's a rule change that smacks of populist inclinations, a last mile knee-jerk response designed to remedy the fact that the state has had almost 30 years to implement a rational, consistent land reform program to effect redress and undo apartheid's legacy, yet has singularly failed to do this. And I think that that really does capture it, Terence, doesn't
Absolutely. Sarah,
Yeah.
what's your feeling? What's your thoughts about this?
I thought my mind was boggled by the regulations put out by the Minister of Labour and Employment, ironically, in which they essentially want to impose targets / quotas on the private sector for
Quotas. I think that's reasonable.
quotas.
Mm.
You know, the demographics of the country to be met in every section, you know, sector of employment within companies, within departments. Other than the extraordinary stupidity in thinking that sort of social engineering can work, he then went on to put out a set of tables on how you make the calculations, which were, we've talked about it, and bizarre beyond belief. I mean, talk about having an innumeracy problem in our education system. But this was like, it was almost like Water Department said, stuff this, you know, enough of the subtle stuff. We're just going to go out there and say the unsayable, and we're going to, you know, we're going to dare everyone to flock to court, which is, of course, what people will do if they don't withdraw it because of public pressure. But I do look forward to the sight of sort of thousands of tractors pulling up outside the union buildings in protest against this. I mean, it's just, I mean, it's yeah. I mean, yeah.
Well, you look. In fairness to tractor-borne transport, it's there are vehicles that could navigate the potholes. The water bill proposed only for new license holders, right? My understanding of this is that it's about converting old to new. So look, although there may be some sort of grace period, but you know, certainly the agricultural experts that I've spoken to says this is now pretty much an absolute bar to particular operations working, and it's see, you also have to have your water licenses renewed from time to time. Now there've been enormous problems with this, you know, over the years. I've spoken to people who waited for years, and I think that there is something that you know, we need to understand about this, that water was the first resource that was essentially nationalized, you know, placed under what, you know, we pointed out, the concept of custodianship. Later, minerals. Now, both sectors, you know, whatever the intentions, and you know, we can argue that point, they are being stewarded by you know, a state that is fundamentally unable to do so competently. And that's purely in administrative terms. That's before you start factoring in the shenanigans that go on, corruption and whatever else. You know, I look at this with great trepidation, because I think it illustrates just how divorced from reality and from pragmatism.
Yeah.
In fact,
it always seems as if after 30 years they've said, you know, really, you know, there's no point in going into this stuff and trying to craft it and sort of bring it in under the radar. But as you say, it's a really a failure to recognize reality. I mean, it's the National Democratic Revolution theory at work. In sort of custodianship, everything must be in the hands of an incredibly incompetent state. It's, if it weren't so serious, it really would be funny. I mean, it's bizarre. I mean, the idea, for example, of a farmer, doesn't matter what color the new owners should be, but having to give ownership to people who are not your choice, whether they're black, white, or anything. They're not in the spheres where they're not sort of big banks or insurance companies that tend to do what they feel is required. This is the stuff that the food shortages and worse are made.
Mm. Yeah. Look, I think that the Minister of Employment and Labour put this very well. I think it was in 2020 that we are going to be very harsh on employers. There's a point at which you are so harsh that there are very few employers left. And I think that what you're seeing here is we're going to be very harsh on farmers. Well, in a way, though, there is something reassuring about this, that it orients our conversation to greater realism. The idea that surely this can't be true. I remember in 2018 with EWC being told that in so many boardrooms and by so many diplomats, oh no, this is all just for show. I remember one contact in Berlin actually gave me a fierce talking to about how dreadful the institute was being now. He's very disappointed, that we are finding the reformist efforts of President Ramaphosa. Well, I'm afraid that that I had it right, and he, perhaps for good, going on the evidence at his disposal at the time, perhaps got it wrong. But yes, I think that's the that we do have to face these uncomfortable realities. Now, and speaking of uncomfortable realities, our third story concerns the forthcoming BRICS summit, and the vexed question of whether Vladimir Putin will get to stride down the Jacaranda-lined streets of Pretoria. I imagine at least the Russians would probably have cars that can navigate our potholes. Will he or won't he? Well, apparently there is some sort of initiative afoot to see whether the summit can be relocated to Russia, and this apparently comes on the back of a legal opinion obtained by the government, which suggests that actually South Africa would be obligated to execute the warrant and arrest President Putin if he should come here, and the grant of diplomatic immunity is simply not adequate. I think this is something that places the ruling party and the state in a bind, in that the ideological and geopolitical sympathies are very, very, very firmly with Russia, but they also rather like being respected as a proponent of international law and all those other lovely things. Now it becomes very, very inconvenient. So what do you do? Do we do another Omar al-Bashir and spirit him out the country? As Gwede Montashi said, orders like this will from time to time be disregarded. I gather that's let's not go towards Mr. Montashi today. Or do we look at splitting the difference and simply going to where the writ of this institution does not run? Sara, you have a legal background. What's your take on this?
Well, you see, the problem they have is South Africa, as a member of the ICC, has to arrest Putin, and the legal opinion says they have to arrest Putin. There's no way around it. Brazil is a problem because it's also a member of the ICC. India is not a member of the ICC, but it's organizing the following month, I think, the G7 conference. And I'm sure the last thing they need to care about is, that they can use that as an excuse. So it leaves China and Russia. China, I'm sure, wouldn't be at all phased. They might kind of look at their smaller BRICS counterparts and ask where their fortitude is. But theoretically, China's not going to give a damn one way or the other whether Putin crosses its borders or not. And in any event, if you're not a member of the ICC, you can be asked to arrest someone who's been who's sought by the ICC, but you can't demand it. So it's then China, or it's Russia, I guess, and Russia's not going to hand over itself, so they probably are options. There's nothing in law that says that they have to have the BRICS summit here. They obviously wanted to have the BRICS summit here because it gives them all sorts of kudos and exposure to the world stage. But if the BRICS is the important stuff, not the image, then let it go to the Northern Hemisphere and let them sort it out.
Right. Michael, your views on this?
I mean, you referred earlier to this kind of almost sense of relief that things are being clarified and actually confronting the reality of the conditions under which we're living and being governed. And I think this is one of them. We're not witnessing a government that's anxious to display any kind of measure of probity or commitment to its international agreements and so on. We're looking at a government that is finding whatever loophole is going to be available, or whatever stratagem is required for them to simply go ahead and maintain those ideological bonds and to wallow in its misplaced nostalgia and all of that. It really does, I think, reveal where we are, that we aren't actually meaningfully attached to certainly the protocols associated with the ICC, and we're quite willing to perhaps go online, go to China, do whatever we need to do to really just get out of this tricky problem that we've got. And that's as I absolutely think you're right, that it's, in a funny sense, it's a good thing to be able to now see the kind of naked truth of these things.
Yeah, well, I've said before that if South Africa is dead set against actually applying it, it would be more candid just to just to leave, resign, withdraw.
Exactly.
But wanting the kudos for being a pioneer in the emerging global governance architecture, or whatever turn of phrase you care to use, but then saying, but we'll only do that when it's when it's convenient, or when it's people we don't like or don't matter to us. That rather smacks of the same set of critiques that South Africa has repeatedly leveled against the United States. Maybe Samuel Huntington was right that the price of principles and theory is hypocrisy in practice. But then one should trim one's behavior then accordingly. Sarah.
I mean, if you think except by and large, the really big countries are not members, and they have their reasons are practical and cynical. But I'm sure South Africa went into it because when it became a member of the ICC, it was purer than the driven snow. Never imagining that being purer than the driven snow when your co-members are not purer than the driven snow would present a problem. And of course, added to that is the fact of, yes, South Africa can get out of it, but not in time for Putin's visit. Now, that's a lovely irony, because, I mean, yes, of course you can go, but we need a year's notice plus an application, plus it's got to go through Parliament. Now, the last thing our government has shown itself willing to do is jump through parliamentary hoops if it doesn't have to, only when it deems necessary and it wants to. So, and it muttered somewhere along the lines that because the ICC has been unfair. It wasn't specific. And I thought, well, unfair, that's like the toddler sort of stamping his feet and saying it's unfair, because so many of the cases affect African regimes, not all. And I suspect part of the reason is because, there's a lot of nasty stuff has happened in Africa. And if it had been 40 years, 60 years ago, the ICC would, a then ICC, if such existed, would then be would have looked elsewhere. So our backyard is a problem.
Actually, on that issue, something that some proponents have brought up, and I think quite accurately, is a lot of these African issues are self-referrals. And I think this is also the case with Serbia, that they have a problem that is difficult for them to deal with, and they're able to pass it on. So, well, you deal with it. And I think in the case of Serbia, Milosevic was still very, very popular, but the incoming government decided that it was actually made a lot more sense for them to play nice with the European Union, because that was money, future, whatever. And so they said, okay, well, you take it, we don't have a problem. And in Africa, much the same, and I facilitated a workshop about 10 years ago, where a senior official from the from DIRCO was present, and he was making this, Africa's being shortchanged, and a civil society representative actually slapped him down and said, no, but these are mostly self-referrals. So yeah, but having cake and eating it.
The big bad West.
Anyway, I think that's pretty much all we have time for today. So, any last words, Sara?
No, I think I've extended the suspension of my disbelief as far as I can go.
And Michael?
Oh, thoroughly enjoyed chatting. I think, we've covered all the essentials of the real problem in the country. We need change. We want to transform, but it's got to be real. It's not not what we get.
With that, a wonderful day to all of our wonderful viewers, and we hope to see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.